Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. Bernie Sanders hates billionaires. So does Elizabeth Warren. To Bernie and Elizabeth, billionaires should not exist. But Bernie and Elizabeth are wrong. Billionaires are vital to your life and to mine. When I was writing my first book, The Lucifer Principle, from 1988 to 1995, I was on the track of pecking orders in human life. Pecking orders in areas from families, economies, and nations to the battles for pecking order position between subcultures. The pecking order battle that we call politics. I was on the track of what scientists call dominance hierarchies. When I first read of a human burial from 34,000 years ago that had been dug up in Sungir, Russia, in 1964, I was outraged. Why? Because of the radical inequalities within that human settlement. 34,000 years ago was 24,000 years before the invention of farming and of permanent settlements. The only tools in those days were made of stone or bone. Folks either followed herds of mammoth or found locations the mammoth passed through on their annual migrations. The Stone Age hunter-gatherers would camp at these choke points, waiting in ambush for the walking Big Macs of the day to pass. The mammoth were a source of meat. So were animals like wild horses, deer, and cave lions. Surrounding plants were a source of vegetables. In winter, God knows what these people did to provide themselves with salad greens. Once upon a time, people had taken shelter from rain and snow in caves. But humans in this part of the world had invented something new, man-made caves. Some of these Stone Age humans used mammoth ribs and tusks as support struts, covered them with mammoth hides, and built the first tents. Those tents were a radical breakthrough in housing and shelter. Most important, or more important, 32,000 years ago was the time of pure hunter-gatherer culture. We are told that hunter-gatherers are noble savages, that they live in peace with each other and in harmony with nature. We are also told that hunter-gatherers lived in a state of equality. None of this is true. In the settlement dug up in Russia, there are 4 graves. Some of them are absolutely barren. The people in these graves are buried outside the settlement itself with no earthly goods at all. Those are the graves of the poor, possibly the graves of a particularly nasty form of the poor, slaves. Then there are the graves of the rich. The top group of corpses is dominated by a man 35 to 40 years old, with a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old who are not related to him and who may have been sacrificed and placed head-to-head. Sacrificed. That means not exactly appreciating life. The man is buried with ivory spears made from mammoth tusks. More important, he is wearing animal skin clothing sewn with beads, pierced fox teeth, and ivory armbands. Sewing, like mammoth skin tents, was a relatively new invention at the time, a life-changing invention. So was the technology for bead making. Remember, these people had no metal tools. So the making of a single bead from mammoth ivory was hard work, hard and time-consuming. How the hell do you drill the hole in an ivory bead center with tools of bone and stone? Lord alone knows. The one thing we can be sure of is that it was difficult. Yet these super-rich Stone Age folks were buried with a total of 13,000 beads in just one of the graves. Beads that would have taken 10,000 hours to make. There were up to 5,000 beads per person on their hide clothing. Even one of the children was buried with 3,000 beads on his clothing. When I first discovered this research, as I said, I was fucking furious. The inequality was outrageous. The difference between the poor and the rich was appalling. The difference between those who died with thousands of useless status symbols, while others were buried outside the encampment with nothing at all, was intolerable. And remember, this is 34,000 years ago. Then I studied up on Stone Age trade for my book, The Genius of the Beast, A Radical Revision of Capitalism. Yes, we humans began to trade at least 120,000 years ago, at about the same time that we became modern humans, that we became people who looked like you and me, that we became the humans known as Homo sapiens. And I realized something. Every tribe had rarities, things that were hard to find, things that came from far away. Those rarities were status symbols. The big trade item of the day was obsidian, a black stone that's very much like glass. Why obsidian? Not only did it glisten and look shiny, when you chipped it to give it an edge, that edge was wickedly sharp. Sharp in a way that inferior stones simply were not. Sharp like a piece of broken glass. If you were a woman and fed your family by rooting for edible grasses with big seeds, leaves, flowers, and tubers buried beneath the ground, a sharp cutting tool to cut through the stem was very useful. And if you were a man and you brought home the bacon by hunting, a weapon that would pierce an animal's tough skin and go deep into its insides was invaluable. It was also a lifesaver if you were up against enemy tribes with murder on their mind, or if you were attacking a nearby tribe with murder on your mind, attacking to steal that tribe's women. But there were differences in the quality of obsidian. Good obsidian was black and shiny and flaked when you chipped it, leaving shards you could turn into knives or arrowheads. But some obsidian was partially transparent and was a marvel to behold. It was more like jewelry than like a kitchen knife, but it was rare and hard to find, which meant that it was likely to come from far away, and which meant that the voyage to get it to you was hard as can be. Who owned these rare grades of obsidian, these jewelry quality hand axes or arrowheads? The big men, the leaders, the folks on the top, the folks on the peak of the pecking order, folks like the rich buried with their beads in Russia. Those folks were the billionaires of their time. Did those obnoxiously rich people of 34,000 years ago contribute anything to society? You bet your ass they did. They were often essential to your group's cohesion, and they forced patterns of trade that may have only reached out 100 miles to stretch farther and reach 180 or 200 miles. These super-rich spread the tendrils, the antennae of your society. They expanded its frontiers. They expanded its reach, expanded its relationships with tribes far away, and expanded its base of resources and its base of knowledge. And they brought forth cooperative networks of tribes, cooperative networks capable of ever bigger achievements. Even in the case of those obnoxious beads with which the rich of Stone Age Russia showed off at the expense of the poor, the rich expanded the productivity of their society. How, for example, could their group afford to have members who abstained from hunting and gathering and instead spent 10,000 work hours on something seemingly wasteful, doing nothing but making useless trinkets, doing nothing but making beads? Somehow the societies the rich folks wearing the beads dominated had to invent efficient and highly productive ways to hunt the meat and gather the vegetables that fed this laboring underclass, and that also fed the big men, the leaders, the super-rich, the billionaires of the Stone Age. Human culture was expanded in its possibilities by the vanity of the big men and women who showed off their novelties and used them to one-up the big men of neighboring tribes and even of tribes far away. As the head of a hunting-gatherer clan of Northwest Pacific Indians, well, actually a salmon fishing gathering clan, said he wanted his name to be in the mouth of every other big man up and down the Pacific coast. In other words, he wanted to spread his influence, and just possibly his intake of ideas and technologies to tribes far and wide. And the way to do that was to show off more surplus than his neighbors and even more than tribes far, far away. In other words, the big man's sheer vanity, his narcissism, and his will to power drove him to turn his social group into a productivity machine. And the more your society produces, the better you eat, even if you are poor. The better you eat, even if you are that form of poor called a slave. And there were lots of slaves, lots of unfortunate war captives among the hunter-gatherer fishing Native American tribes of the Northwest Pacific in their hunter-gatherer days before the imperialist white men ever arrived. What did the networks of trade begun by the desire of the hunter-gatherer super-rich for status symbols, beget? What did looking for rarities for your tribe's big men get you? Here's what the Stone Age trade in obsidian eventually produced according to my book, The Genius of the Beast, a radical revision of capitalism. On the Turkish Konya Plains, 8,000 years ago, Katal Hayuk was in an area rich in wild herds, which included not only aurochs and deer, but the pig Sus scrofa. To harvest this abundance of galloping groceries, the Katal Hayukians were big game hunters par excellence. Their stone tool industry specialized in weapons to bring down large prey, long spearheads, arrowheads, daggers, and the like. But not far away lay the village of Suberde, whose surroundings presented different Epicurean opportunities: wild ass, wild sheep, and the mid to small sized roe and fallow deer, augmented by such relatively minuscule game as fox and wolf. The flint and obsidian crafters of Suberde devised weapons very different from those of Katal Hayuk, miniaturized for small target precision. Even Suberde's arrowheads were an unusual pattern designed for compactness and for exacting accuracy. Each town offered its particular package of technology, raw materials, and technique in the market of intercity trade. Economic competition hit mass circulation 10,000 years ago, when the multi-million-year-old commerce between tribes exploded dramatically. Additional cities sprang up to provide food, shelter, and good service on the paths men used to swap the wares of obsidian mining and tool-making towns with the products of those rich in salt, in pottery, in cloth, in copper, in the red coloring material hematite, and in lapis lazuli from hubs in south-central Russia 1,500 miles away. The cascade of merchandise drew distant centers into a commercial web. Oasis hubs like Jericho provided accommodations and water channeled from underground wells through stone aqueducts to exhausted and thirsting tradesmen pounding the now permanent exchange routes in the desert. And Katal Hayuk, with its hundreds of worship rooms, offered solace to passing merchants filled with uncertainty and anxious to draw fresh guidance from the gods. From 5,500 BC to 2,500 BC, the Middle East's overlapping trade networks for obsidian inched the 1,500 miles from Crete's city of Knossos, eventual birthplace of Greek civilization, to Bahrain, where the Persian Gulf reaches toward the Indian Ocean. But these trade loops were a mere beginning. Obsidian in the ancient Asian city of Hattusis has been traced to Africa's Ethiopia 2,500 miles away. Iranian cities like the 6,500-year-old Tepe Yahya were pivot points for the transport of goods from India to Mesopotamia. A city could not survive without the nourishment provided by a mesh of planters and animal domesticators in its outstretched locality, nor could it thrive without a flow of foreigners delivering essential rarities. The tongue and groove relationship between distant Minneapolises triggered a crossfire of ideas, methods, and styles, swelling the pool of choices within a city even further than before. Each innovation in thought, technique, or manufacture was tossed into a continent-crossing whirl of notions which cosmopolites could tap, test, adapt, and frequently recast. What does this have to do with billionaires in modern America? Everything. What billionaires possess today, you and I will possess tomorrow. Billionaires subsidize rarities. They encourage the production of impossible things by paying impossible prices to be the first to own them and to show them off. Once upon a time, only the super-rich could afford computers, high-fidelity music players, private screening rooms, televisions, and telephones. The huge sums the billionaires paid for the first versions of these things subsidized the mass production factories that would eventually turn out these luxuries for you and me. And the huge prices the billionaire class paid to people like Steve Jobs for his creations subsidized the development of the cell phones that combine the functions of the film screening room, the high-fidelity music player, the computer, and the telephone in the single 7-ounce device you carry in your pocket. Your cell phone, and mine. Today, it's billionaire Elon Musk with his 100-passenger starship, and billionaire Jeff Bezos with his New Glenn rocket, who are about to sell tickets to outer space to their fellow billionaires. Those billionaire customers will shell out appalling amounts of money to go into Earth orbit or to over-orbit the moon. And those billions from the status symbol acquiring billionaires will subsidize the factories that crank out rockets. Billions of dollars from the billionaires will make space travel affordable to your kids. Then there's the philanthropy of the billionaire class. For the last 100 years, organizations founded by billionaires have subsidized things like the Green Revolution of the 1960s. Until the Green Revolution, people died by the thousands in famine in India and China. Then the Ford Foundation, sponsored outside-the-box researcher Norman Borlaug, who created the Green Revolution that replaced starvation with obesity as a major public health problem of the poor. The organizations at the forefront of social upgrade were founded by super-rich folks like the Fords, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie established America's library system and created an organization that for 109 years has promoted international peace. How did these two billionaires, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, make their money? Carnegie made his riches by mass-producing steel and railroad tracks. That steel and those tracks made trips between cities cheap and easy for your great-great-grandparents and mine. And Rockefeller made his money by bringing high-quality lighting to everyone, including the poor. He standardized the quality of kerosene, the lamp fuel that brought light to the world's night. The previous high-quality lamp fuel, whale oil, had sold for $250 a gallon. But Rockefeller drove kerosene's price down to 6 cents a gallon. Rockefeller made a quality of light that only the rich could afford, available even to the poor. Without making the equivalent of billions, Carnegie could never have built his steel plants, and Rockefeller could never have driven down the cost of kerosene. Today, the man who has often been the richest guy on the planet, Bill Gates, has financed pioneering research to rid Africa of malaria and to make vaccines available to Africa's children. Vaccines that Melinda Gates calculates have saved 3 million lives. What's more, if you are on the right, you owe the popularization of the ideas that thrill you to billionaires like the Koch brothers and to self-styled billionaire Donald Trump. If you are on the left, you owe the propagation of some of the ideas that drive you to billionaires like George Soros and Michael Bloomberg. So don't demonize billionaires. Don't criminalize them. Tax them. But don't let Bernie Sanders lynch them. You and I owe many of the wonders that expand our powers to the billionaires who were the first adopters, the billionaires who subsidized the mass production of material miracles so they could make it into the lives of folks of modest means. Folks like you and me. This is Howard the Humongous speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. Howard Bloom. And now for that sneaky, insidious, sly little off button. Let's see if I can find it. Ah, I got it.